bike shop in Cardigan. I've been in the bike trade for 30 odd years in London and here. And I've been a keen cyclist, and I'm now a keen electric biker. So first of all, I want to say good evening to everybody. Thanks to Daniel for inviting me. The first thing I was going to say, did anybody arrive here by bike tonight? No.
I thought about it.
I did. I looked at the map. I've got the electrically assisted bike here, and it's about 11 miles from St Ogmund, where I live, to here. I looked at a good route. It would probably taken me an hour and a half to get here and a good hour to get home. And in this tonight on unlit roads, it's from sea level to about 600 feet. It could be done, but on balance, I think it was beyond the call of duty. It's a bit much. What I want to say a few words tonight under three broad topics. First of all, to provide a little historical and social background concerning bicycles and their usage. And next, to look at the barriers to cycling as transport in rural areas such as ours, and the role that electrically assisted bicycles can play in helping to remove them. And finally, I'll say a few words about the technology and regulations surrounding the electric bicycle. Although it's slightly sloppy, I'll be using the terms electric bicycle and electrically assisted bicycle interchangeably. I mean, really, what we're talking about is electrically assisted bicycles, but I think in tonight's context, there's little chance of confusion. So historically, the crucial, essential characteristic of the contraption that became the bicycle was invented, or perhaps discovered in 1817 by somebody called Baron Karl von Drais, who was a forester from Mannheim in Germany. This characteristic was what we now call the headset. Basically, it's an articulation that allows one wheel of a two-wheeled inline vehicle to move semi-independently of the other. And it's the feature that makes balancing on a bike possible. Baron von Drais named his contraption a Laufmaschine, or running machine. It enabled speeds of up to 8 miles an hour and more over extended distances by scooting with one's feet along the ground and then keeping them raised when you came to a descent. This year is the 200th anniversary of that invention. Pedals weren't added until the 1860s, at first directly onto the front wheel. So the gearing of the bicycle depended on the size of the wheel, and at first the only way to get higher gearing was to increase the size of the wheel. Hence the development of the ordinary bicycle, or the penny farthing, as it was popularly known. In the 1880s, saw the introduction of the safety bicycle, based on a diamond frame. Wheel sizes became equal, or nearly equal, with the rear wheel driven by a chain. And this led in due course to developments in which gearing could be varied by altering the ratio of the number of teeth on the chain wheel to the number of teeth on the rear sprocket, and eventually from that to multi-geared bicycles. The diamond frame formed the basis of the vast majority of bicycle manufacture from then until the 1980s, when welding techniques allowed frames to be built first with larger variations between the tube angles, and then in all sorts of previously undreamt of configurations. There is apparently some evidence of steam power applied to bicycles in the 1860s. But the first proper motorcycle, as we know it, essentially used the skeleton of the safety bicycle, allied with the emerging technology of the internal combustion engine, and was developed in various locations in the 1880s and 1890s. So bicycles have always been used recreationally as well as for utilitarian purposes. They've always been toys as well as tools. Von Dreis's running machine seems to have some of its immediate origins as a horse substitute. In 1815, there was the eruption of a volcano, Mount Tambora, in Indonesia, which actually caused a temporary period of global climate change, which led to crop failure and famine throughout the world in the following years. A corollary of this was that horses became very expensive to feed, and so a gap in the market sort of appeared. Later on, the bicycle became a plaything of the rich, and there were various crazes where popularity soared rapidly and then declined just as suddenly. Racing and endurance cycling on the road has been part of cycling culture since the early days. Again, largely the province of the well-heeled amateur at first, until professionalism and commercialism arrived. Indeed, competitive cycling on the road has experienced something of a revival in the past few years, especially with British winners in the Tour de France, for example. Off-road cycling became much easier and very popular with the arrival of the mountain bike in the 1980s, and is almost entirely carried out as a recreational or sporting activity. Just incidentally, way-marked off-road trail centres are usually found in areas of forestry, of which there are plenty in Wales as a whole, but actually none around here. There's no forestry around here, so no sort of way-marked trails. Cycling as transportation expanded in the early years of the 20th century, when mass production and rising wages made bicycle purchase possible to larger portions of the population. You've probably all seen evocative images from the 1930s and 40s of masses of bicycles pouring out of factory gates at going home time. But in the 50s and 60s, the decline was equally swift, as growing economies enabled the purchase of the motor car to become within the means of a wider section of the population. The 70s and the 80s saw car ownership and usage accelerate even more. The success of the internal combustion engine, the car economy, the oil economy, has undoubtedly brought us undreamed of wealth, but it has also contributed to the existential threat we now recognise as climate change. Particular aspects of this that we might lay at the door of the motor industry include congested roads and polluted air. So at the same time as it was increasing in the 70s and 80s, there was also a rise in environmental awareness and political activism, highlighting the ludicrous illogic that in the limit, increasing car ownership would lead to everybody owning a car, which would belch out poisonous fumes and be unable to move. To give a couple of examples of this activism, the first London to Brighton bike ride in modern times, highlighting possibilities for cycle travel, took place in 1976. And then some of you might know in 1991, Heathcote Williams' polemic poem, Autogeddon, was first published. As is the way with these issues, however, although these cycling and environmental activists were shouting as loud as they could, for many years the volume was not really above sort of squeaky level. The warnings were unheeded and solutions ignored. It's perhaps only in the last 10 years that the squeaking has become more audible and momentum has grown to re-establish the bicycle as a serious mode of transport. Cycling in the city is growing and growing now, and there isn't a major city now without a bike hire scheme. And the latest schemes, dockless sharing schemes, which are becoming quite popular, marry the established technology of the bike with internet-enabled charging and location systems. By charging, here I mean money charging rather than battery charging. Modal share for bicycles is high in continental Europe and is rising in Britain, in major urban areas at least. But where are the utilitarian cyclists in rural areas and here? And for now I'm talking about any bicycles, electrically assisted or not. In particular, where are they in West Wales? For sure, there are plenty of recreational cyclists who go out once, twice or more times per week for fun, fitness and sporting purposes, and plenty of touring cyclists who visit the area to explore, especially in the summer. But there are very few utilitarian cyclists. What do I mean? What is a utilitarian cyclist? Well, I suppose a utilitarian cyclist could be defined as a local cycle user who needn't finish their bike journey without being any more out of breath than they would be if they'd walked. They've had some exercise, but they're not knackered. They don't need to wear special clothes, although they can if they want. They're using their bike to get from place to place in the course of their normal daily activity, whether it be to go to work, to the shops, visit friends, go out for the evening, whatever. The bike is a tool rather than a toy. It's a means, not an end. I should say I've got nothing against toys as well. They're good fun, and all power to them. Now, 2/3 of car journeys are less than 5 miles, and 1 in 10 trips is less than a mile. That's a UK-wide figure. So it's probably, if we allow for rural skew, if we concede, say, that half or even 1/3 of rural car trips are under 5 miles rather than 2/3, that's still a lot of short car trips. So why aren't people cycling? Well, the geography around here isn't all that conducive. Lots of steep hills. Many journeys as well might involve carrying passengers or stuff that's too heavy or bulky to be easily loaded on a bike. There's demographics. The UK population as a whole is ageing. I suspect, I don't know, but the number of elderly and retired people in this region is maybe even higher than the national average. Population density is smaller, meaning that there are larger distances to bridge to maintain a social life. And again, there's the fact that relative disposable income might mean that if only one means of transport is affordable, it's going to be a car. What else? Well, my saddle's uncomfortable, it hurts. The weather, it rains a lot. There's no cycle facilities or infrastructure. Bikes are too slow. In the city, a bike can be as fast as a car over a 5-mile distance. In the countryside, it's probably more like 1 or 2 miles at best. So if we're at all pressed for time, we'd take the car. It's dangerous to cycle. Well, there certainly are road safety issues connected with vehicles travelling with large differences between their speeds. And finally, I think there's the critical mass problem. I don't cycle because nobody else does. It's a bit of a gloomy diagnosis. So can anything be done to improve the situation? After all, there are also many advantages to cycling. There's exercise, the health-giving wind in your hair and your lungs. There's no parking charges, no parking problems, low running and maintenance costs, real door-to-door transport, and speed and convenience in some circumstances. Realistically, there's no way that bicycles are going to take over from four-wheel transport in the rural environment. But I think there is a chink of light where they could play a significant role, and that chink is the electric bicycle. Where I work in Cardigan. There are several villages here within 5 or 6 miles. There's St Dogmell's, Kilgarran, Secrid, Pen Park, Aberporth, to name a few. Doing a journey to town from one of these villages on an electrically assisted bike or providing healthy exercise would not be exhausting and could be achieved in the same sort of timescale as in the car. Electric bikes mean that geographical obstacles are no longer daunting. Hills are manageable. Age and lack of fitness, likewise, are no longer barriers. True, you'll still have to get used to a saddle, but discomfort diminishes over time. What about cycling in the rain? Well, you don't have to, but you can stay warm and dry if you're suitably wrapped up. What about infrastructure? Yeah, it's not great, but there are some Sustrans routes around. There's, from Cardigan on the Aberystwyth Road, there's a cycle path. There's the old railway from Kilgarran. In other places in the county there's some facilities. And there's possibilities for other improvements if there's the political will. An example of that, which is a project that I'm involved in, is we're campaigning to get a multi-use path from St Dogmell's to Poppit to remove the dangers faced by pedestrians and cyclists on narrow single-lane sections of the route. So, if the electric bicycle can help to minimise or eliminate the barriers to cycling, what exactly is the electric bicycle then? We move on to that. So we can analyse what makes a bicycle an electric bicycle, I think, in terms of 4 broad areas. The first one is the bicycle parts, which are the parts that you would have on any other bicycle: the frame, the gears, the brakes, the tyres, etc. Second part is the motor. The third part is the battery, and finally the control systems, joining up. In order to conform to standards that allow it to be ridden in the same situations as an ordinary bicycle, i.e. on cycle paths and bridle paths, as well as on the public highway, there are various constraints that need to be applied. These have come about through a Europe-wide process of consultation and development. So heaven knows what the future will bring in this respect. 3 of these constraints are key for an electric bike to be road legal. The motor must not exceed 250 watts. The motor must cut out when the speed of the vehicle reaches 25 kilometers per hour. That's approximately 15 miles an hour. You can go as fast as you like on an electric bike, but at over 15 miles an hour, the motor is not contributing. You're on your own. The motor can only be actuated through the movement of the pedals. Until recently, models were available with throttle activation. And as I understand it, existing models of this type are still legal, but new ones must have this so-called pedelec system if they are to conform to the type approval and still be considered as bicycles. Most bikes now come with various levels of support from the motor. For example, you get a normal support, you might have an eco or a sport, which would give you a normal support or less support or more support depending on how much you want to put in. Which allow the motor to add varying amounts of power according to the effort being put in. As the product design parameters have matured, 2 distinguishable type designs of electric bike have emerged. The centre motor, which is, as an example of this one, also known as the bottom bracket or crank motor, where the motor is in the middle of the bike there, on the one hand, and hub motors on the other. Hub motors can be built either into the front or the rear wheel, with cabling returning to a control unit that provides power to the motor from the battery and regulate these constraints. All bikes of any sort will have some sort of speed sensor, and some might have torque sensors as well. Centre motors require the frame is modified such that the motor can be bolted on and removed if necessary, for example for maintenance. The pedal cranks form part of the motor unit, and the electronic control system hardware is usually contained in the same unit. The motor then drives the chain to the back wheel, and so it can utilise the gearing of the bike to optimise efficiency. Torque as well as speed can be registered and output varied in response. Centre motor type machines are generally more expensive because they're more sophisticated electronically, more effective, and because the frame has to be made specifically. By virtue of the fact that their wheels are conventional, they're also easier to work on for common maintenance tasks such as puncture repair or tyre replacement. Having to negotiate cabling when trying to remove a hub motor wheel can be easy, but it can turn a quick job into a nightmare. With regard to batteries, the commonest chemistry used nowadays is based on lithium. Various manifestations based on lithium have been termed lithium manganese, lithium iron, lithium polymer. Batteries are mounted on the down tube or in a specially designed rear rack, or increasingly, as in this bike, incorporated into the design of the frame as an adapted down tube. Battery capacity is measured in amp hours, or more correctly in watt hours. Typically capacity can vary from 200 watt hours to 600 plus watt hours, giving a distance range per charge of 20 miles to over 100. Manufacturers of bicycles routinely exaggerate when they're talking about range per charge, usually citing a distance that would be achieved under perfect conditions. To be fair, they often add caveats acknowledging that terrain, rider fitness, and the level of support from the motor will affect the stated figure. You can often get now up to a 3-year warranty on a battery, and some manufacturers, Giant for example, will say that the battery is good for up to 1,000 recharges. It is probably a sort of lifetime of the bicycle if you do the calculations. The wording of these warranties is usually couched in terms such that the given battery will retain up to a given percentage of its original capacity at the end of the warranty period. Battery technology, or rather its perceived inadequacy, is reckoned to be one of the major stumbling blocks to the wider take-up of electric bicycles and electric vehicles in general, as I see. For bicycles, replacement batteries cost hundreds of pounds. Charging times of hours rather than minutes tend to exacerbate the problem of range anxiety, which is something that's with electric vehicles in general. The worry that you could be left stranded for hours while the battery is recharged. That is, if you can find a recharging facility at all. Finally, I'm going to control systems can be subdivided on the one hand into motion, speed and torque sensors, and on the other to battery management. The motion control electronics are generally hidden away in the motor unit or battery casing and regulate the power in response to data from the sensors. The battery management system monitors the battery condition, preventing overcharge or over-discharge. The motion control system design is what gives each bike its particular characteristics. Within the broad legal and regulatory constraints, there's room for a lot of subtlety in the design of the system, with the aim of making the bike handle as intuitively as possible. And the sophistication of these arrangements will be a factor in the cost of the bike. To enable the rider to interact with the system, at the very least there will be some sort of switch on the handlebar, usually with a battery level indicator. More sophisticated systems will have an HMI, which I don't know if anybody knows what the acronym HMI stands for. I had to look it up when I was first confronted with it. It stands for a human-machine interface, which is basically a screen, which as well as battery level, might show the level of support from the motor, the speed and the mileage. Some of them might incorporate a GPS, and some may be gathering all sorts of data about how the bicycle's used, for example, the number of recharges the batteries had. So there we have it. In conclusion, electrically propelled vehicles have been all over the news recently, and I think that's why we're here tonight anyway, isn't it? And are certain to replace carbon-powered ones in the medium to long term. That will happen in the rural environment as much as the urban. The electric car may solve many of the emissions and pollution problems associated with internal combustion technology, but it won't do anything about congestion or about fitness. And it won't need a smaller parking space. It might, he was talking about car obesity, so maybe a slightly smaller parking space. The electric bicycle in a rural situation can't provide the answer to all conceivable transport problems, but it certainly has a place for some journeys as a car alternative. And these are journeys which might not be feasible on an unassisted bike. There are many foreseeable situations where it might provide a worthwhile contribution to the overall mix of solutions. Thank you very much.